We were invited to play a couple of concerts in Witten at the Witten Days for New Chamber Music. That's the West German radio organizes that series of concerts every year outside of Cologne. And the first year we played there, sort of by coincidence, Cage was the invited composer, but they had invited us independently.
1983? 82?
Early 80s, okay. And they said, and Cage will be the composer. You might want to do something of his as well, but it wasn't necessarily the plan. So we organized a few older pieces, and then he wrote to us and said, "I hear we're going to meet at the Witten Festival. I've just written a new piece. Thought you might be interested," and that was Branches. So he sent that, and we learned that for that concert.
My recollection's a little bit cloudier, I think, than Al's, because certainly back in that day, you know, before all the social media and contact capabilities we have, this was all probably through correspondence and phone calls and things. So a lot of the stuff that happened certainly early on with him would have been all through that kind of thing.
I wouldn't have remembered this, but I think this is hilarious. There used to be a payphone up in the main hallway in the old building. And the only way to have, a telephone conversation, and I mean, this was a payphone, and to have long distance, I remember there were a couple of times when I walked up from this to the payphone on the wall in the hallway near the dean's office, put in my quarters to be able to charge it to my home, to call him and say, well, yes, thank you, we got Branches. Now, what do you mean when you say?
So do you remember, I don't remember the sequence of, he was here and saw us do, well, there's the whole Music for Three thing, but where does that fall with the Bowling Green thing that we did with him, where he did a similar thing to what's going to happen when we do the Concert Nova thing?
After the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, after the first time in Germany, which was very nice because they put us in a little pension, it was not a big hotel, but just a tiny little thing. So we each had a room in this little place, but there weren't many of us. So for sure, every day for breakfast, you could meet him at breakfast or see him during the day. So it was actually very easy to hang out and just chat over breakfast or something without other people around. And then it was maybe only 1 year later, maybe it was the next season, he had a similar thing in Italy, a little concert series in a couple of different places, Turin and Ivrea.
84 and that.
And there was actually a different plan for that, and that fell through. Something about a big computer plan or something like that, which fell through. So he called us. He thought, or his management. He said, "Well, since we have to cancel this thing, let's just do again something with the guys from Cincinnati and have them come and play a bunch of stuff." So, so he called us and said, "Can we meet again and do that?" And so we went to Italy. I think it was the next season, and sort of did the same thing. And I think it was at that time that actually, in this case, it was just me. There was one time I went to his room because he was having, for lunch. And you've seen these pictures, of him carrying around a big wicker picnic basket, like hunting for mushrooms or all of that. But he also carried, these were, before TSA. He would take this big wicker picnic basket with him on his tours to Italy, and then he had all of his homemade bread and homemade peanut butter and all of this stuff, and I don't know, he just said, "Yeah, sure, come up and have lunch or something." And that's where he then showed me and described this whole thing that he had just made this piece, which at that point was called Music for Six. It was specifically another commission, but he said, I got this great idea of a whole new system of how to make windows of opportunity, and it's kind of like a Calder mobile and all of this stuff. And he was an excited kind of guy. Let me show you, and it works like this, and then you do this and this. So that's how he actually introduced the idea, and then, it's a whole other story of how that then turned into music for three for us.
Not too much time must have gone by, because one of the first times I saw you guys play was in our Ann Arbor, when you guys played music for three at the PAS convention. So that would have been, what, a year or two later? 84.
And actually, we had agreed we had been asked to play a concerto at that PASIC. The opening night was 3 different people or groups, each playing a concerto, and we had a friend who had agreed to write a piece, who then called right after that Italy trip and said, I'm really sorry, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be finished. I feel badly about it, but I'm just letting you know now, you should plan to do something else.
Good luck.
Yeah. Good luck on your national, opening night concert with concerto, but I thought I'd give you a month or two to let you know. So as that story goes, then what are you going to learn in how are you going to get a concerto in a month? I started thinking, well, is there some cage thing that we could that could possibly be fashioned together? And I'd sort of been paying attention to this stuff, so I remembered that in '76, the bicentennial, he had written this big piece called Renga, which was for any number of orchestra musicians. And for the bicentennial, it was done as a kind of a concerto grosso, with 4 vocal soloists doing a piece called Apartment House, because he had the image of them being these different pieces. And it was a Native American doing chants and such things, some Sephardic Jewish cantor, an African American doing Negro whoops and hollers and such things. And what would the 4th have been? I think the 4th one was like Appalachian folk songs or something like that. But these 4 different slices of American life, but in a vocal quartet against this smeary background. And it occurred to me, well, couldn't you just replace the very discursive foreground of vocalists with percussionists doing something like that, and let the background be the same, and then you'd have this concerto grosso. And because he had showed us this whole new system of music for something, which is done on a computer. So in that case, I called him up, and I called him up, and it was late in the day, and I said, I have this great idea, and we could take Renga, and I explained everything we just explained now. And then if you would just push the button on your computer and make more percussion parts, because he was also very excited that this was sort of new to him, that he could do this all by computer. He didn't have to toss coins and all of that stuff. And I said, but you already made 1 percussion part. Isn't it true you could push the button and make 2 more? And then you would have 3 percussion parts. And this phone call was late in the afternoon, and he was whatever, in his 70s or something. He was kind of low. I was high energy, he was low energy. And he said, oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. And I felt like a complete jerk.
I said that on more than one occasion to you.
Yeah. Right. So I felt really stupid and terrible, both for having bothered the guy, and he thought it was a stupid idea, and also that we had nothing to play for the convention. But then the true part of the story is, the next morning at 10 o'clock, when the phone rings, and he said, and I pick it up because it was on a cord on the desk. Yes.
Good thing you clarified.
Yeah.
You have the phone.
Yeah, we even have this. We still have that phone. And he said, Alan, it's John. I've been thinking about your idea. I think it's marvelous. Now, tell me again how it's going to work. So we talked about it, and then he said, you're right. I could just push that button, and we could make more of those things. So that's how this thing came about that we then did in Ann Arbor. And then he wasn't going to come to Ann Arbor. He was not part of that PASIC. But then, since we were going to play his piece, then actually Tom Sywee called maybe on the payphone up here or something and said, could you call Cage and get him to come? Well, I mean,
Didn't he somehow get induced into the Hall of
Yes,
Fame?
and he said, and this was still early enough
So
in
it
that
became a
whole
big
thing.
fet for him.
So they said, we will put him in the Hall of Fame. We'll make this the time we put him in the Hall of Fame. He could come and hear you guys play this thing, and he could be the guest and all of that stuff. And so another phone conversation, and he had never heard of PAS, and he said, well, what do you think I should do? I mean, I've always liked percussionists. You think I should come?
Little did he know.
Yeah, and I said, nah. I said, don't bother yourself. If it's convenient, you could come, or don't. So he came, and that's how we saw him again there. Mm-hmm.
This last banquet I went to was to watch John Cage speak at the banquet.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing had happened in Bowling Green when we did the But What About crumpling paper with him speaking. Because I remember you had pitched this idea to him and he didn't like it. So what would be better than to have this atmospheric sound happening while he was doing his speech? And at least that's what you had related to us, was that he didn't like that idea. But then the next day, or maybe even the next, the next couple of hours, he called you back and said, yeah, I like this idea quite a bit.
And then it was very funny after that. So we did, as we're going to do on this concert. So we were all out in the hall, and it's funny. I got the book with the text that he was reading in it, Mushrooms and Variations, and it's still all sort of crumply because I kept knocking water on this book as I was trying to follow what he was reading while I did my own splashing. And we're just going by our own counts and making sounds, but his texts are all by, he had made a timing that where he should read fast and slow and all of this stuff, and he was on stage and we were on the audience, and then we all came on stage and took a bow, and then we walked off stage, and he says to us, how'd you do? I did very, very poorly. I did very badly. Meaning, he got ahead or behind his own stupid little timings, not that anybody could possibly know or care. But I said, we did very well. So.
What do we...
We're doing crumpling, right?
And trio.
And then
The
we're doing
woodblock trio.
Probably as a part of branches, yeah.
And then branches. And that's it.
That's it. Yeah.
So pretty atmospheric type of things. Branches. We've been playing at a table for years where we were pretty close to each other, but we each have our own independent set of sounds, and then incorporate the slow movement of Amores as kind of a slow pace to it. We all have slightly different tuned little blocks of wood. That's real delicate.
Branches is for all wooden or vegetable items. And so every sound that we make somehow has to be, but it's a little like the But What About, in where he gives a little parentheses about sounds slightly reminiscent of what you might hear in nature. So we all had to go through an I Ching process to come up with, I believe, 10 sounds a piece, and then through timings and stuff, sometimes you erase some of the instruments that you use, so you may end up just using 4 of the 10 or something like that. But essentially, we're just trying to create a little wooden soundscape with that piece. So the trio, which Rusty mentioned, then dovetails nicely with that because it's also little homemade wood blocks, slats of wood, not wood blocks themselves, but just little blocks of wood. The one thing I remember John telling us about that was he saw us play that, and I may be partly responsible for that because I was using, I remember croquet balls, which were made out of wood, and kind of clanking them together. We had a few homemade slit blocks that we used in the piece, And then I think I also had a log that at one point I was just striking with a hatchet. And he was not real happy about it just because of, in his mind, I think that was part of the problem with percussion, was that it was too attacky. And so he preferred sustained sounds if possible.
I remember him saying also he found it too theatrical.
Oh, I didn't remember
Which was,
that.
I was very surprised by that, because I think we were completely sensitive to the idea that we weren't performing anything for anybody. We were just quietly, gently going about our own activities, which happened to make gentle sounds. But in those days, we were still starting the piece with this electric popcorn popper, which was sort of, I mean, it was a very random, sort of nice idea that the piece would start when the oil got hot enough and the popcorn started to go. But that sort of set a tone for a kind of theatricality, I guess. And you always had those the line of dominoes, which you knocked over, which also makes a lovely little sound, and it's very, again, you just, you do almost nothing and it does something. So I think we thought we were being very sensitive to this idea, and for him, he said, "I'll have to play it for you sometime. I'll show you," but I thought you were too. And then, there are videos of him, and he's got one cactus and a feather, and he just sort of brushes the cactus with a feather, and that's all he does, for 10 minutes. So that was definitely nuts.
We had something I really liked too, where we had a half of a music stand, and then punched down into it was a dead branch from a tree. One of the guys had hung a couple of maracas off the thing, and they looked fairly natural, but it was, again, more of a theatrical thing where there was a little reaching up and swirling. Maybe drew attention to us. I've seen the video from 25 years ago. Have you watched that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, they sent us that and asked for the release years ago.
Oh, yes.
I toughed it out. I watched the whole
Yes.
thing. And it's a little horrifying, but it doesn't seem theatrical at all. So.
Well, the early stuff, that'd be mine. The early stuff, more toe tapping, in the 40s. Usually a band of composers who would play the harder parts, on any collection of instruments that were more kind of found, tin cans, and kind of put together where there was something, where there was some rhythmic activity, and usually some kind of toe tapping, duple underlying, and then some other instruments that might be played by, the dancers themselves or friends. Imaginary Landscape number 2 comes to my mind just for that. I'm sure these guys have other examples. Through construction, especially that idea of some kind of real, I guess for lack of a better, toe tapping kind of duple feel with other things kind of interrupting it, and either very intense, which is and lots of highs and lows, and moving around quite a bit. A lot of use of tin cans, and some various things like lion's roars and conch shells, buzzers, noisemakers, radio, and Credo and Us, just some alternate sound sources, and sometimes in certain pieces just altogether different music kind of joining in with the other music.
In one sense, I guess it's understandable that percussionists mostly know and love that music. That's what they think of John Cage, and they just keep playing that decade after decade. And of course, he famously always said that he wasn't interested in hearing any of his older music. He was only interested in whatever he was writing now. And sometimes it feels too bad that the fact that he was so interested in the idea of percussion and percussionists for his whole life, so that every period of his compositional development has an example of some kind of percussion music, but mostly we only hear from the very first days.
We had recorded some of that stuff over the early 21st century and released the disc with some of the landscape rust you mentioned. We have a previous recording of Amore's, and a couple of the more toe tapping things. I think the things like the things you've mentioned about What About and then the concerto, the later stuff is a little bit hard to condense into modern students' capabilities. Sometimes they're looking at a screen. They may be listening with some kind of earbuds or something, and I think there's just an attraction to that kind of thing where there's actually something happening, and so you get the attacks, you get the rhythms, you get all that stuff crisscrossing. Once he got into the indeterminate stuff, I think that's more of a happening sort of thing where maybe your Concert Nova people will enjoy that more, because that's something that you have to be there for. You can't reproduce that in any way. You can't really record it and put it out there. I can't think of any media that would really cover the kinds of stuff that we're going to be doing on that Tuesday.
We were asked to be involved in a recording of the complete percussion music of Cage, and we started, but I think we were always somewhat resistant, if not insufficiently enthusiastic about it, just because it's so hard to imagine so many of these later pieces making any sense on a CD or out of someone's laptop. They are. He really did. He was honest about embracing his relationship to Zen in that sense and sound, and that it was an experience that you had to be there for, and it wasn't traditional music in listening for 8 minutes and getting a picture of that one thing. So we never did record the complete percussion music.
Not apropos of any of those questions, but the stuff he used to do with Merce as well. Is that stuff something that ever came out in some kind of condensed form, like on DVDs? Could you get DVDs of Merce's band with him in front with some of his people doing concerts?
Yeah, I guess there were a number of long, even 2-hour television programs where there would always be excerpts of that kind of stuff.
Where it might work on a big screen, right? Even watching Merce and company do their thing. But computer screen? I'm not looking at you accusingly at all. I'm just looking at you while I'm saying that his perspective today is so small. It's a little scary. So it's nice that Concert Nova is going to try to make it a kind of a happening.